Here is the first truth, the one no careful listener will dispute and the one that sets this whole history in motion. In the royal household of a small northern kingdom, a prince turned his private appetites into the quiet terror of other people's workdays. Everyone from the laundry women to the keepers of the candle stores knew it. Everyone from the stable boys to the old men who swept the cloisters in the winter evenings watched it, named it, and then swallowed it back down. This was no courtly romance and no tavern boast. It was policy by whisper, an institution enforced not by law but by hierarchy. That is where we must begin, with the open secret that was never written into statute yet carried the force of a command. I speak as one who has pored over lists that were not meant to be read together. The kitchen ledgers tell of sudden dismissals and emergency bonuses, all clustered in certain months. The chapter minutes from the royal chapel record confessions that a priest described in careful euphemism. The pay register for the castle guard shows shifts added to the late watch whenever the prince took a certain corridor by preference. A poem copied by a lady in waiting, stiff with prudence, names no names but lingers on the image of a door that does not bolt. The threads are scattered, but when gathered and drawn taut, they pull a single shape into view. The prince cultivated the soft targets that a palace makes in abundance. Young maids who scrubbed the scullery steps, seamstresses sent to mend his sleeves, pages ordered to light his fire and then told to stay, chamber attendants who had no patrons powerful enough to protest. Before we go further, I must give the actors their names, for it is the naming that makes this account answerable to truth. The king was Arden IV, called Arden the Careful by those who liked him and Arden the Counting Hand by those who did not. His queen was Isolde, brought from across the sea with a dowry of ships and a taste for order. Their only surviving son, the axis about which our calamities turn, was Prince Roderick. The steward of the household was Lord Petras, too clever by half, who memorized the balance of every room and every purse. The royal confessor was Father Michal, a man who loved the sound of a ritual more than the bite of a commandment. I set these proper names down so that we do not hide behind generalities. The evil of a place is often the sum of many small permissions. We will not give those permissions the shelter of vague terms. The first basket of lies arrives disguised as routine. The staff ledgers show a practice that began as a safety measure and became the mechanism of a crime. When the prince set his sights on a new face, the steward would promote the young woman to a different wing of the palace. It looks merciful on paper. It reads as if care stepped in. In reality, those shifts created a moving target that the prince treated as a hunt. Doors lock differently in different wings. Supervisors change. The time of the night watch is altered by a quarter of an hour here, a half hour there. A hunter thrives on variety. A system that changes just enough becomes a garden of opportunity. We must hold to one more truth that will feel, at first, like a stone in the shoe. The prince's offenses were no secret among those who wore collars of linen rather than gold. There is a line in a letter from a washerwoman to her sister that has not faded though the ink is pale. She wrote that the prince's hands smelled of bay leaves from the bowls in the great hall, and that she could no longer stand the scent during feast days. She wrote that she wished the kitchen would use rosemary instead. Do not dismiss this as adornment. What a hand smells like can empty a seat, can rearrange a hallway, can make a young woman walk the long way round even if it means coming late to her duties. A palace is made of shortcuts and fear blocks them. That is how a rumor becomes architecture. The king's face appears in the records not as an act of blame but as a pattern of absence. Arden the Careful spent winters counting the hides of cattle and summers inspecting floodgates. He preferred the predictability of water to the unpredictability of blood. His court knew he would rather argue about grain tithe tables than reconcile feuds. He trusted the queen to order the household and the steward to keep the gears oiled. In his trust was a vacuum, and in that vacuum Roderick learned the permission that power offers to those who never learn to be ashamed. The queen loved precision. She loved clean lines and predictable meals. She instituted the practice of marking the bottoms of cups so that the same chalice would always return to the same place at table. She believed that a well-placed object calms a restless mind. She was right. She did not understand that some minds do not seek calm. They seek the slack in the rope. It was Lord Petres who learned to make a ruinous ledger look like a mercy. He took note of which maid would accept an extra coin to help her father pay a fine. He arranged marriages at short notice, as if sheltering the young women from further danger, but always to men in his own web of obligation. He kept secrets as if they were investments. If the prince's appetites gave the steward material, then the steward's patronage network turned those appetites into leverage. Men have gone to war over less than this: the feeling that you owe another man your wife's peace of mind. Father Michal, for his part, recorded confessions with such generality that absolution became an easy coin. He told the penitent to pray for the prince as one prays for the weather, inevitability made sacred. When a maid, bolder than her years, demanded that God love justice more than rank, the confessor offered her a place in a convent that, far from bringing her safety, would only remove her from witnesses and from any patron who might speak her name in a dangerous room. The language of virtue can be bent into offense. It can pen the wrong people in. I have read the guard logs. I have counted the bumps in the pattern. On 3 nights each month, the prince would take the corridor called the Swallow's Run, where the walls narrow and the footsteps echo twice for every step. On those nights, the captain of the guard added a jesting note, a flourish that reads like a drunk man's flourish, but which I now believe was a way of convincing himself that he did not see what he saw. When power insists on its innocence, even a soldier will choose a joke over a report. I do not exonerate the captain. I indict the mood that made it easier for him to laugh than to write. Now we come to the hinge of the matter. The open secret turned catastrophic when it reached an impossible threshold. A maid named Elena, a quiet girl who signed her name with care because letters felt to her like little cloisters, came to the queen's antechamber with an appeal written by a scribe. She had asked a friend to find words she could not speak without shaking. The petition charged the prince with his misuse of her, and asked the queen for removal to a safe household, not a marriage arranged by the steward but a place of real shelter. To make the claim believable, Elena named objects that only someone who had stood too near would know. A cut on the prince's left thumb from a hunting knife that he refused to bandage because he liked the mark, a twist in the leather of his belt where it had been repaired, a phrase he used when he had not slept. It was precise without being lurid. It was brave without becoming a spectacle. It reached the queen's hands on a spring morning when the palace smelled of beeswax and new grain. Here I must tell you what the queen did, and why that action thrummed like a struck chord through the whole house. She did not summon the steward. She did not summon the confessor. She summoned her own ladies and swore them, not by the saints, but by the names of their daughters. She ordered an inquiry that would leave no mark in the official records. She instructed that locks be examined and that night watches be moved without warning. She had the laundresses asked, not by men with ink on their fingers, but by women who knew how to listen without making a face. There is a line in a daybook kept by the queen's own hand that simply reads, "There is more," underlined once. The queen did not know how much more there would be. She would learn. 2 days later, a bracelet went missing. It was a narrow band of worked silver with a clasp shaped like a lion's paw. It had always lived in a box that the queen kept beneath a stack of needlework, almost as if she placed her domestic life over her adornments like a modesty veil. The bracelet was not valuable except that it was hers, and that it had belonged to her mother. Its loss would have meant little if not for where it reappeared. The guard who kept the door to Prince Roderick's inner rooms found it near the hearth, half buried in ash, as if it had been pushed there hurriedly by a toe. The guard turned it over twice, and seeing the tiny scrape on the inside where it had once snagged on a thread, he recognized it. He did not know whether to return it to the queen or to pretend it had never been in his hand. He chose to report it to Lord Petres, which is to say, he placed the item that would unravel us all into the hands of the man most skilled at knotting. Lord Petres, master of appearance, did not rush. He held the bracelet as one weighs a coin that might be counterfeit. He asked a single question: who had been scheduled at the prince's hearth that morning to lay the fire? The answer was Elena. The steward smiled in the way a trap smiles when the animal steps inside. He sent for Father Michal, who came with a face like a drawn curtain. The steward and the priest arranged a story that turned Elena from an accuser into a thief. It was so neat that it almost clicked into place by itself. Almost. Because the queen had already begun her own inquiry, and because the queen knew the exact angle of the scratch inside the bracelet, and because the queen did not believe in coincidences when men with good hair and good handwriting offered them too readily. That is the moment when a private vice became a public danger, when a quiet petition became a conspiracy, and when one woman's precise courage struck the bell that had hung silenced above the great hall for years. I have traced every path outward from that bell's single note. I can tell you who pretended not to hear, who put their fingers in their ears, and who ran toward the sound. In the next part, we will walk those paths together. We will meet the people who decided that the truth must be bent again and again until it broke, and we will listen to the crack that still echoes in the kingdom's memory. Here is the first truth of this chapter, and it will clear the air like a struck bell. There was no theft. Elena did not take the queen's bracelet, and the ash that dusted the clasp came not from a hearth she tended but from a hearth where she had never been scheduled to kneel. I can say this without hedging because I have matched guard rosters against the soot counts recorded by the chimney sweeps, and I have read the note the steward forgot to burn, a note that shifted the morning fires by a single hour on a single day. That hour was the notch where the trap's jaw closed. The story that turned Elena into a thief was made by men who knew the palace better than the clockmaker knew his own gears. Lord Petras and Father Michal did not improvise. They sketched their plan with care, then allowed chance to do the rest because chance makes a lie feel like weather. The steward arranged for Elena to be reassigned to the prince's wing on a date that had already been moved forward in the watch log. He then had the guard at the Swallows run trade places with his partner, a change so small it would look like courtesy. Meanwhile, Father Michal spoke of avarice in his homily with such gentleness that those who heard him believed they had thought of the word themselves. A rumor thrives best when it resembles conscience. The queen's inquiry met the steward's counterplot like two tides colliding in a narrow sound. Isolde did not advertise her questions. She sent Lady Morel, whose face looks like caution itself, to speak with the laundry forewoman before dawn. She ordered beeswax seals pressed into the screws of certain hinges, so that if a door were lifted from its pins in the night, the fracture of the wax would tell the tale in the morning. She asked the sisters in the infirmary to count, very quietly, how many women sought remedies for interrupted monthly bleeding. She had the carpenters shave slivers from the thresholds of 2 rooms and mark those shavings with a drop of lampblack, so that any footprint would carry the stain to a mat and make its shape legible. These were not the gestures of a jealous woman. They were the instruments of someone who understood that a palace is a device designed to hide as much as it shows. The first break in the steward's fiction came from a bucket. The ash around the prince's hearth was peat black, sticky when damp. The ash near the queen's work table, where she kept her needlework, was pale and feathery from seasoned oak. A maid trained to carry scuttles by rote can tell the difference by weight alone. The bracelet found by the guard near the prince's fire wore a whisper of oak ash along the scratch inside the band. Not peat ash. Only a person who had taken the bracelet from the queen's private coffer and then hurried it toward the prince's room could have left that signature. The object had traveled wrong. Objects tell the truth that people fear to speak. I have seen the note that changed the fires. It was written by the steward on a scrap of inventory parchment, and it read, in his neat hand, "Shift the hearth duties for the eastern corridor. The prince complained of smoke on his cloak yesterday. Move the scuttle to the 7th hour." The note was initialed by the guard who later claimed to have discovered the bracelet. His initials tremble. He was the kind of man who disliked decisions and loved a superior who relieved him of them. He would have been loyal in a village. In a court, he became a tool. When the queen confronted Petras, she did so with figures rather than accusations. She asked him to explain why, in the months when the prince's night walks increased, the household spent more on new locks but replaced fewer bolts. She asked why the physician received payments marked for the quieting of spirits that matched, with uncanny fidelity, the dismissal dates of certain maids. She asked why the pantry issued wine to the confessor on mornings after the prince's feasts. The steward replied that the world often rhymes without being conspiratorial. He smiled as he said it, and every woman in the room understood that a man who weaponizes coincidence is rehearsed in cruelty. Father Michal worked the other side of the cloth. He assured the king that the queen's distress came from the strain of an heirless marriage, that her mind had sharpened into suspicion, that her piety needed rest. He advised that Elena be sent to a seaside convent for her own safety, as if safety were a room you reach by closing your eyes. He began to preach about order, about the duties of rank, about how a house falls when its roof storms against its walls. This is the rhetoric of barricades built from liturgical phrases. I have read this kind of soothing in other ages and other palaces. A soft voice can smother a fire if the people in the room want to imagine smoke as prayer. The maids, who had no coat of arms but who carried keys and brooms and water, did not wait for theology to rescue them. They formed a ledger of their own that I found years later stitched into the lining of a winter cloak in a trunk forgotten behind a rotted chest. The ledger was a row of names sewn with blue thread, each knot marking a night when a door would not stay shut. Besides some names, there were tiny loops, a code that meant a child was quickening. They were not historians and they were not lawyers. They were witnesses who chose a language the steward could not counterfeit. I wept over that lining, not because it was dramatic, but because the cloth was ordinary. History hides in the ordinary until someone insists upon its speech. The captain of the guard, who had written his jokes into the log, began to falter. His jests turned brittle. He closed a remark mid-sentence one night and did not finish it until 3 days later, as if he had seen something that unstrung his words. I have compared the ink. The first half of the sentence is brown with iron, the second half is grayer, made with water thinned and hurried. The sentence reads, finally. The swallow's run sounded tonight as if footsteps were weighed down with metal. The only people who wore metal at that hour were guards, the steward, and the prince if he had changed quickly from hunting boots to slippers and slipped the spurs into his pockets. The sound of metal where there should be none tells of men out of place. Queen Isolde set a snare, and she set it with the precision of a woman who marked the bottoms of cups so that order might defend the mind. She chose a night when the prince's pattern said he would hunt. She dismissed her ladies early. She put on a plain linen gown and covered her hair with a maid's cap. Over her shoulder she slung a basket that held no coals and no sewing, only a folded length of chain mail wrapped in cloth to mimic the weight of wood. She did not tell the steward. She did not tell the confessor. She told only Lady Morel and the youngest of the laundresses, because the very young and the very old keep secrets best, having not yet learned the bargain of ambition. Her plan was simple. She would walk the eastern corridor at the hour shifted by the steward's note, and if the prince or any other man reached for her, the guards concealed behind the arras would step forth. She would unmask the pattern with witnesses instead of rumors. She would turn the garden of opportunity back into a hedge of thorns. It was a brave plan. It was also the kind of plan that assumes betrayal will arrive late rather than early. Betrayal arrived early. Lord Petras had placed a boy in the scullery whose task it was to carry messages when the prince's moods changed. The boy was quick and thin and skilled at disappearing behind furniture. He heard the queen instruct Lady Morel to set the hidden guards. He carried this news to Father Michael, whose lips moved when he was not speaking, as if prayer had worn a channel in his mouth. The priest went to the steward. The steward went to the prince. And the prince, who loved variety more than safety, smiled at the thought of turning a snare into sport. On the appointed night, the guards behind the arras were called away by the captain, who had been given a report of a fight in the stables. There was no fight. There were only 2 boys paid to shout and then to quiet down when the captain arrived. The corridor lay thin as a vein, and the torches were trimmed too short, so that the light was low and the shadows generous. The queen walked with steady steps and her basket of chain mail that looked, to any passing glance, like scuttle wood. Her heart must have made the same sound that a clock makes when a room holds its breath. I know what happened next from 3 sources, none of which agree about motive but all of which agree about motion. The boy in the scullery, older then and consumed by remorse, told a traveling friar that the prince came up behind the woman in linen with a hand already open to seize. Lady Morel, sleepless and unflinching, wrote in her last letter that a man breathed in as if to speak her name and then did not speak it. The guard who returned late from the staged fight said only that the corridor smelled of bay leaves, and that a cap lay on the stones like a shed skin. In that instant the queen's trap held, but it held the wrong prey. The prince had been led to a shape in the dark that the steward and the priest had prepared for him. A shape that would mask who walked and make any witness later swear that it was a maid. I will not be salacious. I will not dress harm in adornment. What matters here is not the bed but the deception that drove a son toward a figure he believed to be another of his unresisting victims. What matters is that the men who should have protected the queen instead moved the pieces on the board so that she would stand, for a breath, in the same place where so many powerless women had been made to stand. The prince reached out. The queen turned. Recognition did not arrive in time. That is the hinge from which the rest of this history swings. There were witnesses, but they were prepared to see the wrong thing. There were records, but they were written by hands already coached. There was a cry, but the corridors of a palace are trained to carry music and lose screams. In the next part, we will gather what can still be gathered and lay it out in daylight. We will trace how the scandal was reshaped into a narrative of sin and mercy, how the steward bartered survival, and how the truth, denied room in the official chronicle, spread instead like blue thread inside a winter cloak. Here is the blunt truth that no official record will tell you. The moment the queen recognized the hand that gripped her arm, the palace ceased to be a house of order and became a cage of conspirators. The prince recoiled too late. The queen, in shock, uttered his name, and in that single breath the trap collapsed. The hidden guards never returned in time. The steward already had his story prepared, and Father Mikhail stood ready to sanctify silence. By morning, the event was no longer a crime but a tale rewritten. The steward spread word that the queen had been found wandering the halls in a fever of the mind. He showed the king the bracelet again, claiming it had been planted by Elena, who was quietly sent to the convent by force. Father Mikhail preached of temptation and divine trials, urging obedience to the crown. The king, who hated scandal more than sin, accepted the explanation like a man closing shutters against a storm. But the palace servants knew. They whispered of the cap left on the stones, of the bay leaf smell in the corridor, of the queen's pale silence during supper. They stitched their whispers into cloth, hid them in ledgers, and carried them in lullabies. The official voice of the kingdom said, "Madness and mercy." The hidden voice said, "Betrayal and blood." It was not yet open war, but it was the beginning of two histories, the polished one carved for the court, and the raw one that beat inside the walls like a muffled heart. Here is the final truth, and it is heavier than the crown itself. The scandal was never erased, only buried. The queen lived on, outwardly composed but inwardly broken. She no longer set traps, no longer ordered hidden wax seals or secret hinges. Instead, she wrote nothing more than a single phrase at the back of her daybook. There is more, but not here. Prince Roderick's reputation outside the palace remained untarnished. He was described in public chronicles as a restless hunter, a patron of music, a youth whose excesses were those of vigor, not of vice. Behind closed doors, however, he became unpredictable. He trusted no one fully, not even the steward who had shielded him. Lord Petras and Father Mikhail, meanwhile, tightened their grip, trading silence for influence, weaving a court where truth was currency and every debt bought another lie. But the maids, the laundresses, the forgotten witnesses, refused to let silence be the last word. The cloak with the blue thread ledger passed secretly from hand to hand, each woman adding a stitch, a loop, a sign that the memory endured. Over years it became less a garment than a record, a fabric archive of wrongs unspoken aloud. When Roderick finally rose to the throne, the cloak surfaced again, this time not in whispers but in rebellion. A faction of servants and minor nobles presented it as evidence, a tapestry of quiet testimony. It was not enough to depose him, but it was enough to fracture loyalty. His reign was never secure, and his name, once polished for legend, curdled into warning. And so the last ledger was not written in ink or on parchment, but in cloth, in memory, and in the unbroken refusal of powerless voices to forget. The kingdom endured, but the story of the king's son who preyed upon his own household lived longer than his crown. That is the end of the tale. a history denied its place in chronicles, yet preserved in the murmurs of servants, in a queen's unfinished line, and in the knowledge that silence can be shattered not with swords, but with memory.